Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, it is a great pleasure for me to preside the second session of this conference here in wonderful Barcelona, in this fantastic room here. But we are not only in a fantastic room, we have two fantastic speakers today. The first speaker will be Jens Schröter on my right hand. Jens Schröter is a professor of New Testament studies, not just New Testament studies. I'm quite jealous about the second part of this description of his chair of New Testament and New Testament apocryphal works. His own work covers more or less the whole of early Christianity, but he is a world-leading expert on the one hand on Jesus traditions, Gospel of Thomas, and he is co-editor of the new Antike Christliche Apokryphen, Ancient Christian Apocrypha, volume, I think 1,200 pages or something like that, of translations and editions of Christian apocryphal Gospels. So there's perhaps nobody else in the world who could be a better candidate to speak about canonical and apocryphal Gospels here. Jens, it is a pleasure for me to give the word to you.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for this kind introduction. I also welcome all of you to the second session of our symposium here on the origin of the New Testament. My focus will be on the relationship of apocryphal and canonical Gospels within the development of the New Testament canon. So I will pick up some aspects of the two papers we heard yesterday, but I will take a somewhat different perspective, and that I will ask for the meaning of the apocryphal Gospels within the development or with regard to the establishment of the four Gospel collection. So what does it mean that there are four Gospels that eventually were established as parts of the New Testament canon, although there were many other Gospels as well in the 2nd and 3rd century. So that will be, roughly speaking, the topic of my paper. And you should have a text. And also, there's also a handout, a handout of 2 pages, which summarizes the main aspects of what I will talk about. So I will read through the paper now, and my first paragraph is the four Gospels of the Church in the 2nd century. Already in 1897, Adolf von Harnack noted that it is a highly paradoxical fact that the Church has four Gospels of equal value. Analogies from history of religion would demonstrate that usually one book is in high esteem, but not several of them at the same time. With this observation, Harnack indicated a problem of crucial importance for the development of the New Testament canon. Why was the story about Jesus' earthly ministry, his passion and resurrection, included among the authoritative writings of the Church in 4 versions and not just in 1? A preliminary answer to this question could be that the four Gospels that eventually received authoritative status in the Church were accepted in several communities already at an early stage as the testimony about Jesus and his followers. The Christian philosopher Justin Martyr could support this view when in the middle of the 2nd century he mentions the apostles and their followers as those who had composed the Gospels, which Justin therefore calls their memoirs, apomnemoneumata in Greek. Obviously, Justin knew of several Gospels and ascribed them to the authority of the apostles, who in his eyes were companions of Jesus and therefore also eyewitnesses of his earthly ministry, as well as to their followers. Occasionally, Justin can even quote from these writings, for example, the words spoken by Jesus at the Last Supper. Justin does not cite these words literally from the already existing Gospels, but in an abbreviated form, probably from memory. It is not entirely clear whether Justin knew of all 4 canonical Gospels but he does not mention any, because he does not mention any author of a gospel by name. It is nevertheless obvious that he knew the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, probably also the Gospel of Mark, which he calls the memoirs of Peter, an expression which in all probability does not refer to the Gospel of Peter, as sometimes was argued, but to the Gospel of Mark. It is not clear whether Justin knew of any other Gospel than those that later became part of the New Testament. At least he does not refer to any other Gospel than those that contain the memoirs, as he tells it, of the apostles and their followers. Justin is not concerned with the unity of their testimony, so it is not his concern to demonstrate the unity of these Gospels, nor does he feel the need to defend the memoirs of the apostles against other Gospels that would have been also in use in Christian communities. A secure starting point for a quest for Gospel collection, therefore, is not Justin, but Irenaeus, who in the third book of his Against Heresies refers to the fourfold gospel, which he defends against the reduction to the use of just one gospel by certain heretical groups on the one hand, and to the expansion to more than the four gospels on the other. Unlike Justin, therefore, Irenaeus regards it as necessary to defend the four Gospels of the Church against those who rely on just one Gospel, as the Ebionites, Marcion, or the Valentinians, who prefer the Gospels of Matthew or of Luke or of John, but also against those who boast of a possession of more than the four Gospels, for example, the descendants of Valentinus, who bring forth their own writings, among them a Gospel of truth, which, according to Irenaeus, agrees in nothing with the Gospels of the Apostles. Irenaeus is therefore concerned with the unity of the fourfold Gospel and with its defense against the Gospels of a heresy. This view of Irenaeus is supported by other testimonies from roughly the same time as Irenaeus' Against Heresies. The famous letter of Bishop Serapion to the community of Rossos, written towards the end of the 2nd century and preserved by Eusebius, has to be mentioned here, as well as the Canon Muratori, that according to a majority view was composed around 200 in Rome. Serapion's letter distinguishes between the true testimony of Peter and the apostles on the one hand, and writings which were forged in their names on the other. The context of Serapion's letter is a dispute about the gospel according to Peter that had caused trouble within the community of Rossos. Serapion, who at first was inclined to allow the reading of this gospel, later regarded it as problematic because it would support the views of those whom we call Docetists. Therefore, he announces a second visit, perhaps to explain in more detail why the community should refrain from using this gospel, the gospel of Peter, or the gospel according to Peter. What is important for the purpose here is that Serapion mentions false writings, pseudepigrapha, forged in the name of apostles, and the use of them, of these pseudepigrapha, by heretics. It is therefore not in the first place, if at all, the content of the Gospel of Peter that is problematic for Serapion, as he frankly admits, but its origin and its impact within the community. The Canon Muratori, a document that can be regarded as an introduction to the writings of the New Testament, also makes a distinction between accepted and rejected or forged writings. The canon does not mention any other gospel than those that were accepted by the Church in the course of the 2nd century. The preserved text of the canon starts with a sentence probably referring to the Gospel of Mark, followed by remarks on the Gospels of Luke and John. It can be assumed, therefore, that the canon introduced at its beginning the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in this order. According to the author of a Muratorian fragment, the disciple John composed the Gospel of John in his own name, while his fellow disciples and bishops reviewed it according to their own revelations. The author of the Muratorian fragment concludes that there are various elements in the individual Gospels, but this makes no difference to the faith of believers, since it is one initial spirit that has declared all things about Jesus Christ. Later, the Muratorian fragment mentions the heresy of Marcion, for which Paul's letter to the Laodiceans and the Alexandrians were forged. The text also mentions apocalypses, of which only those of John and Peter are accepted, although some do not want the letter to be read in the church. The Muratorian fragment provides insight into a situation in which the writings of what was later established as the New Testament were separated from others that were also used in Christian communities. With regard to the Gospels, the author of a Muratorian fragment apparently did not consider it as necessary to defend the four Gospels against others, but he underlines the unity of their testimony about Jesus Christ. The same tendency to emphasize the unity of the writings of the New Testament can be observed in other parts of the text, for example, in the passage on the Pauline letters and the Apocalypse of John, which, regardless of their addressing of individual communities, according to the author, are directed towards the whole church, which is spread throughout the whole extent of the earth. Finally, Origen, in his homilies on Luke's Gospel, states that the church has four Gospels, while the heresy has many. He mentions several of these Gospels, for example, the Gospel according to the Egyptians, another one according to the 12 apostles, and the Gospel that Basilides dared to compose and gave it his own name. Also, Origen, therefore, presupposes the acceptance of four Gospels of the Church and defends them against the Gospels of a heresy. The testimonies mentioned so far show that towards the end of the 2nd and in the early 3rd century, Christian theologians considered it as necessary to emphasize that the church is based on certain writings or collections of writings, which are distinguished from other writings that, according to them, were used by heretical groups or forged by heretics or both. With regard to the Gospels, the emergence of the four Gospel collection on the one hand, and the rejection of other Gospels on the other hand can be observed. This is supported by the fact that there was no single manuscript that contained one of the four canonical Gospels, or Gospels that later became canonical, together with a non-canonical one. Moreover, the external testimonies about the Gospels, for example by Irenaeus and Origen, show a distinct awareness of the difference between the four Gospels on the one hand and the apocryphal or non-canonical Gospels on the other. This is also true for Clement of Alexandria, who can quote sayings of Jesus from the Gospels of the Egyptians and the Gospel of the Hebrews with approval, but by the same time, he distinguishes these Gospels from the four Gospels of the Church. Against this background, in the next paragraph, I will look closer at the relationship of canonical and non-canonical Gospels in the early stages of transmission of the Jesus tradition. So my second paragraph is canonical and non-canonical Gospels within the development of the New Testament canon. At the outset, it should be noted that the terms canonical and non-canonical reflect already a later perspective that presupposes the New Testament canon. The use of the terms canon and canonical for the accepted writings and the opposition of canonical versus apocryphal does, however, not appear before the middle of the 4th century. If we use these terms for earlier stages of the Jesus tradition, it has therefore to be kept in mind that there was no clear-cut distinction in the 2nd and 3rd century between accepted and rejected writings, but rather a process of differentiation between writings that were circulating in early Christian communities. If we look closer at the Jesus tradition of the 2nd and 3rd century, it comes as no surprise that the situation described by Harnack in the statement quoted at the beginning is significantly more complex than in Harnack's times. Of course, already Harnack was aware of non-canonical Jesus traditions, for example, of the Achmim fragment with the Gospel of Peter and of Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 840. But it is obvious that the situation since Harnack has changed considerably by the discovery of a great number of manuscripts with non-canonical Jesus traditions. In the first place, the Nag Hammadi codices have to be mentioned among those writings as, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, or the so-called Egyptian Gospel were found. Other writings which are closely related to the Gospels from Nag Hammadi are the Gospel of Mary from the Berlin Codex and the Gospel of Judas from the more recently published Codex Chakos. Besides these texts, there is a great number of fragments which sometimes belong to writings attested also by larger manuscripts, for example, the Greek fragments of the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary, while other fragments are part of writings which are only attested by these sometimes quite small pieces of papyrus or parchment. This is, for example, the case with Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 840, Papyrus Egerton II, or the Coptic fragment from Berlin, sometimes called Unknown Berlin Gospel, or also Gospel of the Savior, a title which was confusingly also used for Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 840. The manuscript evidence, therefore, leads to the following conclusions. First, from the variety of writings containing the title Gospel at their beginning or at their end, it becomes clear that this title, Gospel, was used in a very broad sense and not for a specific literary genre, for example, for narrative accounts of Jesus' earthly career. A definition of gospel as a presentation of Jesus' activity in narrative form could therefore only be defended on the basis of the New Testament Gospels, but such a definition would exclude, by definition, many writings from the 2nd and 3rd century that were also called Gospels. Second, the reception of a Jesus tradition in the 2nd and 3rd century was a complex phenomenon that cannot be reduced to a simple dichotomy of canonical versus non-canonical. The numerous texts and fragments consisting of Jesus traditions rather point to a multifaceted spectrum of perspectives on Jesus circulating in early Christianity. The Four Gospel collection, together with its theological justification by Irenaeus and others, was an attempt to come to terms with this situation of various, sometimes even contradicting interpretations of a Jesus tradition. Harnack's observation, that can also be formulated as a question, why are there 4 Gospels in the New Testament, is therefore much more urgent if we take into account the great number of texts containing Jesus traditions in the 2nd and 3rd century. One approach to explain this complex situation was, and still is, to describe the relationship of a non-canonical to the canonical Gospels within a model of literary dependency, or at least of a secondary status of the non-canonical texts. This perspective was applied, for example, to the Gospel of Thomas, shortly after the discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices, but also to other texts, for example, to the Egerton Papyrus or the Gospel of Peter. The main justification for this view, that the non-canonical Gospels are dependent on the canonical ones, is the observation that the non-canonical texts originated later than the canonical ones, probably, and often show traces of influence of the canonical Gospels. This is already true for the title, Gospel according to, or Evangelion kata, which is quite unusual for ancient books, and was probably taken over from the canonical Gospels in writings as, for example, the Gospel according to Thomas, the Gospel according to Peter, or the Gospel according to Mary. But there are also other indications for influence of the canonical Gospels on the apocryphal ones. On the other hand, scholars have long since referred to elements in the non-canonical Gospels which cannot easily be explained as reduction of their canonical forerunners. More often than not, these non-canonical texts give the impression of creative reinterpretations of a Jesus tradition, sometimes by taking up elements from earlier layers of that tradition. Wherefore, the independence of the non-canonical Gospels from the canonical ones was defended time and again by pointing to their specific usage of traditions and their distinctive perspectives on Jesus' person and his teaching. Moreover, in more recent research, it became increasingly clear that the contribution of the non-canonical Gospels to the development of a Jesus tradition would be only insufficiently be explained within a model of dependency or within a model of dependency or independence. In the first place, these writings, the non-canonical writings, provide insights into a vibrant development of Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd century. My proposal would therefore be to replace the paradigm dependent-independent with one which takes the contribution of the non-canonical Gospels to the perspectives on Jesus' meaning in the 2nd and 3rd century more seriously. My suggestion would be to describe these interpretations as reinventions or creative reinterpretations of Jesus' activity and teaching, whereby their relationship to the canonical Gospels is one, but certainly not the only, and even not the most important aspect. It would rather be appropriate to apply the term memories of Jesus to the non-canonical writings as well as to the canonical ones, to highlight the fact that regardless of differences in detail, to highlight that all of these writings aimed at making the figure of Jesus and his teaching meaningful for their own time. In what follows, I want to exemplify this proposal by selecting 3 texts which might illustrate how non-canonical Gospels contribute to the perspectives on Jesus in early Christianity. A closer look on these writings will also sharpen the focus on the question, why are there 4 Gospels in the New Testament canon? I switch to the 3rd paragraph, 3 examples of non-canonical Gospels. I will begin with a look at the Gospel of Thomas, probably the most discussed apocryphal Gospel in the last decades. Immediately after the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Codices in 1945, scholarly attention has focused on this text in the 2nd Codex from Nag Hammadi. One of the 3 Greek fragments from Oxyrhynchus, which on the basis of a Coptic manuscript could be identified as texts with close relationships to the manuscript from Nag Hammadi, one of them, namely Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 654, even contains the incipit, which mentions the hidden sayings, logai apokryphoi in Greek, spoken by the living Jesus and written down by Thomas. This observation of a Greek fragment indicates that already in the 2nd century, a collection of sayings of Jesus was compiled as hidden sayings of the living Jesus. If we assume that this collection also was entitled as a gospel, this would demonstrate that a gospel could be used, that the title gospel could be used for a collection of sayings of Jesus without a narrative frame in the 2nd century. This is, however, not certain, because the title, Gospel according to Thomas, could also have been added only at a later stage, because it is not attested in the Greek fragment, of course, but only in the Coptic one. The Greek fragments, the 3 Greek fragments, belonged to different manuscripts from the late 2nd and early 3rd century. These Greek texts show different relations to the Coptic text. Remarkably, 2 of them, Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 654 and 655, were written on a roll, whereas only Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 1 belonged to a codex. The Gospel of Thomas is therefore well attested, given the sheer number of manuscripts from the pre-Constantine period. It should not be overlooked, however, that Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 655 differs from the Coptic text in that this papyrus, this fragment, contains a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples, whereas in the Coptic manuscript, the same content appears in the form of separated sayings of Jesus. Grenfell and Hunt, who published these papyri before the discovery of the Nag Hammadi text, therefore entitled Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 1 and 654 as Logia Jesu, or as new sayings of Jesus, whereas Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 655 in their edition has the title Fragment of a Lost Gospel. Of the several theories about the origin of the Gospel of Thomas, one of them traces the earliest layers back to the 1st century, proposing that the composition of Jesus' sayings as it is preserved in the Coptic manuscript had its roots in early collections of sayings of Jesus that were later combined and expanded. This theory was proposed in various models since the discovery of the Nag Hammadi writings. An alternative approach suggests that the Gospel of Thomas was composed not before the 2nd century and would consist of sayings of Jesus from different writings, among them the Synoptic Gospels. The Jesus sayings and parables from different strands of tradition would have now been presented as individual units, introduced individually with Jesus says or Jesus said. Sometimes it was even suggested that the Gospel of Thomas should be regarded as a Gnostic interpretation of a Jesus tradition. Also, this view was developed already at an early stage in the history of research on the Gospel of Thomas, but it is also defended in more recent publications. I do not want to enter into a detailed debate about this issue here. It is important to note, however, that in contemporary discussion, the distinctive presentation of a Jesus figure and his message in the Gospel of Thomas has gained increasingly more attention than in previous scholarship. It was suggested in this context, for example, by Stephen Patterson, that the concept of this composition, the Gospel of Thomas, might have been influenced by themes and motifs from Middle Platonism. The most recent commentary on the Gospel of Thomas by Simon Gathercool likewise refrains from interpreting the writing, the Gospel of Thomas, on the basis of a hypothetical model of development and takes it for granted instead that regardless of possible older traditions or earlier traditions, a date for the composition of the Gospel of Thomas was in the 2nd century, probably in the Antonine era, so Gathercool. Patterson and Gathercool do not regard the Gospel of Thomas as a Gnostic writing because it does not contain a demiurge account of creation and recounts the origin of Adam in a positive way, tracing this origin back to a great power and a great wealth. This is in saying 85. However, in the Gospel of Thomas, philosophical and mythological motifs can be observed that make it much more probable that regardless of a possible background of the Gospel of Thomas in older Jesus traditions, the sayings collection introduced as hidden sayings of a living Jesus, written down by Thomas, originated not before the second half of the 2nd century. The hermeneutical concept of the Gospel of Thomas can be inferred from its literary genre as a collection of loosely connected sayings and schreiai, which are introduced in most cases with Jesus says. In some instances, these sayings are linked with each other by a catchword. In other cases, sayings or parables of the same genre are arranged with each other. The soteriological perspective of the Gospel of Thomas can be illustrated by the following example. In sayings 83 and 84, and you have both of these sayings on your handout on the first page, a theory of knowledge is developed. According to saying 83, there is the light of the Father in which his image is hidden. The human beings can see the images, but the light within the images is hidden. It will be revealed, quote, in the image of the light of the Father. This last phrase is a notorious crux interpretum, since it is not clear what the image of the light of the Father should be. If one does not amend the text, as is sometimes suggested, the phrase could refer to the light of the Father that will reveal the light within the human being. The saying would then speak of a future revelation of the light within mankind that corresponds to the revelation of the light of the Father itself. In any case, the phrase, the image of the light of the Father, is difficult to explain. Nevertheless, the saying obviously aims at a distinction between visible images and invisible light. It refers to a future event in which the invisible light will be revealed. Saying 84 is closely connected to this concept in that it speaks of likenesses and images of the human beings. As in the saying before, a theory of correspondence between images and their likenesses is presupposed. In the background, there is an interpretation of Genesis 1, verse 26 and 27 on the basis of a Platonic concept of image and likeness. This interpretation of Genesis 1, verse 26 and 27 also appears in Philo, who in his allegorical interpretation of the law in Book 1 and on the creation of the world, 134, distinguishes between two kinds of human beings. The immortal, heavenly human being created according to the image of God, and the earthly, mortal human being. The soteriology, Christology, and ethics of the Gospel of Thomas can be interpreted against this background. According to the Gospel of Thomas, salvation means to find the way back to the heavenly origin and to the transformation of the human beings into their heavenly images. This way to salvation is revealed by Jesus' words, which save from death. They are characterized as hidden because they contain a meaning which has to be explored to find the way back to the kingdom of the Father. Jesus represents the perfect human being who possesses the light of the image and makes it known on earth. The ethics of the Gospel of Thomas is orientated towards the solitary ones, or the monachoi, who are advised to live according to Jesus' words. There are several features in the ethical admonitions of the Gospel of Thomas which indicate that such a way of life means to abstain from Jewish rules, as for example circumcision, praying, fasting, or almsgiving. Other Jewish rituals are interpreted from a radical ethical perspective. The solitary and elect shall love their brothers as their own souls. They shall practice Sabbath observance as total rejection of the world, and they shall fast from the world, which is called a corpse. The Gospel of Thomas, therefore, offers a unique interpretation of Jesus' sayings by using older traditions, among them many sayings and parables which also appear in the Synoptic Gospels. These traditions are compiled as a doctrine which is based on a specific anthropology and soteriology with affinities to Middle Platonism. My second example deals with the Gospel of Mary. The bulk of this text is preserved on a Coptic manuscript in the Berlin Codex with close relations to Nag Hammadi codices. The Gospel of Mary is the first writing in this Berlin Codex, followed by the Apocryphon of John, of which 3 copies are preserved in the Nag Hammadi codices. The Sophia of Jesus Christ, the third writing, which is also preserved in Nag Hammadi Codex 3. And the Sophia of Jesus Christ also has strong links to Eugnostos, a writing of which 2 copies exist in Nag Hammadi Codex 3 and 5. And a 4th writing called the Act of Peter. As with the Gospel of Thomas, Greek fragments also could be identified of the Gospel of Mary, in this case Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 3525, written on a roll again, and Papyrus Rhinans 463. These fragments consist of passages that are also attested in the Coptic manuscripts from the Berlin Codex with only slight variations. As the Gospel of Thomas, also the Gospel of Mary can be dated into the 2nd century as a text that was originally written in Greek and later translated into Coptic. The preserved text begins on page 7 and ends on page 19 with the title, The Gospel According to Mary. The first 6 pages, as well as pages 11 to 14, are missing. That means that roughly less than half of a text is preserved. The text on page 7 starts in the middle of a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples about creation, matter, and sin. Jesus instructs his disciples that everything that exists in the world will eventually be dissolved into the roots of its nature. Obviously, there was a preceding discussion about the nature of creation and the way to salvation. This can be inferred from Peter's question about the sin of the world, which follows with Jesus' speech. The Savior, as Jesus is often called in the Gospel of Mary, explains that sin does not exist by itself, but is brought forward by mixing matter with spirit. The Gospel of Mary, therefore, supports a Platonic anthropology, according to which the human being consists of a soul, which is of divine nature, and is incorporated into a body from the material world. To ignore this mixture and to turn toward the material instead of a heavenly world means to pervert the true nature of human existence. After having said this, the Savior, or the Blessed One, greets the disciples and departs from them. The disciples grieve with great sorrow and are comforted by Mary, who prompts them to praise the Savior's greatness because he had made them into human beings. Obviously, the Gospel of Mary narrates a farewell scene of Jesus and his disciples after his resurrection. This is not entirely sure because the dialogue could also be placed just before Jesus' passion and death, as it is the case in the Gospel of Judas. In the first apocryphon of James, the dialogue between Jesus and James takes place partly before and partly after Jesus' passion. Given the character of many of these dialogues, for example, in the Epistola Apostolorum, the Sophia of Jesus Christ, or the Apocryphon of John, it is, however, more likely that the Gospel of Mary ties up with the appearance stories of the risen Jesus in the New Testament Gospels. With other dialogue Gospels composed in the 2nd century, the Gospel of Mary would then place Jesus' teaching in the period between his resurrection and his ascension. It is presented, the teaching of Jesus is presented as an initiation into a special kind of knowledge about the nature of the world, the origin of a human being, and the way to salvation. In other Nag Hammadi writings, this topic can even be expanded to philosophical doctrines about the origin of the world and the formation of the upper divine realm. It cannot be decided, of course, whether the Gospel of Mary also contained a creation myth or a description of different emanations, as for example the Apocryphon of John, the hypostasis of the archons, or the writing which is entitled On the Origin of the World. However, the way to salvation is presented here in the Gospel of Mary as the ascension of the soul through different powers to the rest in silence. Ascension of the soul, wherefore, means, according to the Gospel of Mary, that the soul has to overcome the dominion of the powers that seek to capture it into the lower world and the matter. The way of the soul to salvation is presented in the Gospel of Mary in the form of a vision that a vision to Mary that she subsequently conveys to the disciples. This causes annoyance on the side of Peter, who complains that the Lord has revealed these things to a woman. The Gospel of Mary may therefore also reflect conflicts between different groups of followers of Jesus in the 2nd century who relied on Peter or Mary as their protagonists. It is also possible that a programmatic appeal to Mary as a woman apostle is involved, although this might also be a modern perspective and not that of the ancient document. Mary's vision, that is in the center of a preserved text, is placed in a narrative frame with the farewell scene of Jesus and his disciples at the beginning and the controversy over Mary's words and her role, and finally the decision of the apostles to preach the gospel. This concept of a narrative framework for the instruction of the resurrected Jesus about the origin of the world, the nature of a human being, and the way to salvation appears in several of the Nag Hammadi and related writings. Jesus is presented as coming from the upper world and returning to it after his resurrection. During his earthly activity, he has taught the knowledge about the true origin of mankind and opened up the way back to that origin as the goal of a true human life. The Gospel of Mary, therefore, presents another perspective on the concept of a gospel in the 2nd century. It presents a specific perspective on salvation that is based on a philosophical concept of the world and the human being with relations to Middle Platonism. There are some links to the Gospel of Thomas and its idea of a human being, especially in the use of the term Son of Man. This term is used in both writings as a designation of a true human being that, according to the Gospel of Thomas, is presented by Jesus, and according to the Gospel of Mary, is within the disciples. This is a striking reinterpretation of a designation that also appears in the canonical Gospels, where it is related to Jewish apocalyptic writings, especially to Daniel 7, verse 13 and 14, and transfers this meaning to Jesus. But it is remarkable that in the Gospel of Thomas, neither a creation myth nor the way of the soul to the upper world is narrated. My third example refers to the Gospel of Peter, or more precisely, to the Achmim fragment. The pages of this text of a passion and resurrection narrative beginning in the middle of a sentence and also ending with a fragmentary sentence, show indications, the manuscript pages show indications that the scribe did only have this part of a larger text in front of him, because the beginning and the end of the text are marked with crosses. It cannot be answered, of course, whether the fragment was part of a whole narrative of Jesus' earthly career or contained only parts of it. Even the small fragments that could be identified as parts of the Gospel of Peter, Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 2949, or that were occasionally brought into relation with it, for example, Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 4009, also these fragments cannot help to answer that question. It should also be noted that Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 2949 were only secure witness for the Gospel of Peter besides the Achmim fragment, probably belonged to a roll, not to a codex, as is also the case with two of the Greek fragments of the Gospel of Thomas and the Greek fragment of the Gospel of Mary, or one Greek fragment of the Gospel of Mary. As the Gospel of Thomas, also the Gospel of Peter has close relationships with the canonical Gospels. The Passion narrative contains specific elements that also appear in the Gospels of the New Testament. As the Gospel of Matthew, also the Gospel of Peter contains a reference to Pilate washing his hands and the story of a guard at the tomb. With Luke, the Gospel of Peter shares the note about the presence of Herod Antipas, who is erroneously called a king in the Gospel of Peter, in Jerusalem, his presence in Jerusalem at the Passion events and the crucifixion of, the presence of Herod in Jerusalem and the crucifixion of two malefactors, kakogoi in Greek, with Jesus. There are also minor hints to a knowledge of the Gospels of Mark and John. Regardless of these indications of knowledge of the narrative elements that also appear in the New Testament Gospels, the Passion story of the Gospel of Peter would not be adequately explained by regarding it merely as a compilation and redaction of older traditions. Rather, such a model would be in danger of not taking sufficiently into account that the Gospel of Peter is a creative reinterpretation of the Passion and resurrection of Jesus. The depiction of Jesus' burial and the finding of an empty tomb show several characteristics that point to a distinct depiction of the Easter morning, as for example, the extensive narration of the guarding of the tomb, the remark about the crowd at the tomb, and of course, the detailed description of Jesus' resurrection. A striking feature throughout the Gospel of Peter is the strong emphasis on the hostility of the Jews towards Jesus. The mockery of Jesus is described in great detail. Sometimes the Jews are even ridiculed, for example, with regard to their anxiety because of the darkness at midday when Jesus is crucified, and their self-cursing when they perceive that they have done evil to themselves by crucifying Jesus. The anti-Jewish polemics is certainly one of the most characteristic features of the Gospel of Peter. It is closely related to the elaborated narrative of the soldiers at the tomb, in that the elders of the Jews take the initiative to go to Pilate and ask him for soldiers to guard the tomb for 3 days in order to prevent, quote, that his disciples steal him away and the people suppose that he is risen from the dead and they do us evil. When those who were with the centurion saw the miraculous signs accompanying Jesus' resurrection, they went to Pilate asking him to command the centurion and the soldiers to say nothing of the things they had seen, because it would be better for them to be guilty of the greatest sin before God than to fall into the hands of the people of the Jews and be stoned. The fear of the Jews, a motif that is also mentioned in the Gospel of John, where the disciples are assembled behind locked doors in Jerusalem after Jesus' crucifixion. This motif occurs again in the Gospel of Peter in the account of the way of Mary Magdalene and her friends to the tomb. Hence, in the Gospel of Peter, the Passion and Resurrection events are narrated against the background of a specific historical situation. It is not certain whether the text reflects the same circumstances as, for example, the Apocalypse of Peter or the martyrdom of Polycarp, as was sometimes suggested. In any case, the Gospel of Peter obviously interprets the passion and resurrection of Jesus against a background of increasing hostility of the Jews towards the followers of Jesus. For this purpose, the author uses and conflates traditions which also appear in the New Testament Gospels, whereby he seems to be unaware of, or at least not interested in, the concrete historical circumstances of the passion events, the role of the Jews, and the historical profile of the different groups of the Jews. The historical knowledge is thus much less precise than it is the case in the canonical Gospels, although even where a distance from a period before 70 can be observed. The Gospel of Peter therefore interprets the historical events of Jesus' passion and resurrection in a situation in which they gain a new meaning. The hostility of the Jews towards Jesus and his followers is contrasted with the resurrection of Jesus, which is accompanied by marvelous events, for example, the stone that starts itself to roll and moves sidewards, the head of the two men supporting Jesus reaching to heaven, and that of Jesus himself overpassing the heavens. The cross following them and answering the voice from heaven. The events of passion and resurrection in the Gospel of Peter are therefore undoubtedly more detached from their historical origin than this is the case in the New Testament Gospels. They are instead made suitable for a situation in which Christians felt threatened by the Jews and defended their own identity in a situation of increased persecution and hostility. Unlike the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter shows no interest in philosophical speculations about the origin of the world or about Jesus' role as a teacher of hidden doctrines. Rather, this Gospel is concentrated on a reinterpretation of Jesus' passion, or perhaps even more of his entire earthly career, in a new historical context. The Gospel of Peter is therefore not necessarily a rival of the canonical Gospels, but can rather be regarded as an elaboration and fresh interpretation of Jesus' passion and resurrection, providing a new meaning of these events. The three test cases discussed here could easily be multiplied. They show that the interpretation of a Jesus tradition in writings of the 2nd and 3rd century can be viewed from two perspectives. These writings can be regarded as receptions of older Gospels, which later gained canonical status. This perspective has dominated research on the non-canonical Gospels for many years. With regard to the three writings discussed here, but also to many other texts, for example, the Papyrus Egerton II or Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 840 or the so-called Dialogue of the Savior from Nag Hammadi, the relationship to the non-canonical Gospels has been discussed at length. The thesis that these writings could be regarded as receptions of a Jesus tradition going back to early sources independent from the canonical Gospels should thereby not be played off against the obvious fact that these writings are contributions to an ongoing process of reception and reinterpretation of a Jesus tradition. Thereby, the writings of the 2nd century, more often than not, show traces of influence of traditions preserved in the narrative presentations of Jesus' career of the 1st century. These narratives, or parts of it, were now interpreted from new perspectives. This leads to the other perspective on these writings. The observation that they are probably influenced by older so-called canonical Gospels should not lead to the conclusion that they are only of minor importance for the reconstruction of the reception of the early Jesus tradition. Such an assessment would confuse the quest of the origin of a Jesus tradition with a study of its reception in early Christianity. With regard to the historical circumstances of Jesus' activity and fate, the writings of the 2nd century are of only minor importance because it was not their primary concern to provide historical information about Jesus or Jewish traditions of the 1st century. Rather, they present perspectives on Jesus' meaning from the perception of Christian authors or groups in the 2nd and 3rd century. The non-canonical writings therefore highlight a plurality of approaches to the meaning of Jesus as the context for the emergence of the 4 Gospel collection. Some of these writings might have contained an account of Jesus' career comparable to the canonical Gospels. This might be the case with the Gospel of Peter and the Papyrus Agathon, although the scope of these writings remains uncertain. The concept of the Gospel of Thomas is a different one. It selects sayings of Jesus from several strands of tradition and presents them as hidden sayings of a living Jesus, whose meaning has to be found in order to gain eternal life. This concept is not so much interested in the historical circumstances of Jesus' life, although some episodes of his earthly career are also part of this collection. But the main focus of the Gospel of Thomas is to present the sayings and parables of Jesus as a guide for those who live as solitary ones and seek to find the way to the kingdom of the Father. As in the Gospel of Thomas, also in the Gospel of Mary, a philosophical concept of a human being forms the basis for the interpretation of Jesus' teaching, which is supplemented by a mythological account of the way of the soul to the upper world. Regarding the range of receptions of Jesus' traditions in the 2nd and 3rd century, the question has to be raised again. Why did the Church accept 4 Gospels, not just 1, but also not 5 or 7? Out of the many as the authoritative testimony about Jesus. So my 4th point and last point is the apocryphal Gospels and their meaning for the development of the New Testament canon. In his testimony about the fourfold Gospel mentioned above, Irenaeus takes up an older tradition which substantiates his claim of 4 Gospels of the Church by referring to the 4 edges of the earth, the 4 winds, and so on. It is not easy to explain, however, why none of the other Gospels was accepted and why early theologians did not argue for just one Gospel, which would fit much better to the unity of the Christian message. This question cannot be answered by referring to the historicity of the 4 Gospels or to their apostolic origin, since there is no clear-cut distinction between legendary and historical elements in both the canonical and the apocryphal Gospels, and also apocryphal Gospels are ascribed to apostles, as for example to Peter and to Thomas, while on the other hand, the Gospels of Mark and Luke have only indirect apostolic status as authorized by Peter and Paul. The reason for the selection of the 4 Gospels can also not be explained with a mutual agreement over against the other Gospels. The differences, especially between the 3 synoptic accounts on the one hand and the Johannine portrait of Jesus on the other, are no less than, for example, between the fragments of the Papyrus Agathon and the Gospel of Mark, or the passion stories of the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Peter. It would have been perfectly plausible, therefore, to choose, for example, 3 Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John, and to refer to the analogy of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, or only 2, Matthew and John, with the analogy of Jesus as a human being and a divine figure. Reason for the acceptance of exactly 4 Gospels is also not just their usage in early Christian communities. As Eusebius' account about the Gospel of Peter shows, this Gospel was read at least in the community of Rossos and even provoked the letter of a bishop about its status in community gatherings. Moreover, it is highly improbable that Christian communities in the 2nd century had access to all 4 Gospels that later became canonical, and would have regarded these 4 Gospels as the authoritative and consistent testimony about Jesus Christ. It is much more probable that early communities possessed only 1 or 2 Gospels and used them for their reading. On the other hand, the reason for the rejection of the non-canonical Gospels was obviously not in the first instance their content. In not a few instances, Christian theologians seem to have had only superficial knowledge of these writings. Their main concern instead was that these writings caused conflict and separation within the communities by supporting perspectives on Jesus that are not in agreement with the teaching of the emerging church. So how can the relationship of the non-canonical Gospels to the canonical ones be described or explained? And why did exactly 4 Gospels constitute the formative testimony about Jesus? preliminary answer, or some aspects might be formulated as a conclusion. First, the view developed by Irenaeus, Clement, Origen, and the canon Muratori, quoted above, is in agreement with the manuscript evidence. Although there are several manuscripts of non-canonical Gospels from the 2nd and 3rd century, a much greater number of manuscripts contains the canonical Gospels. This is perhaps not just by coincidence, but rather shows that the canonical Gospels were more widespread than the non-canonical ones. This is supported by characteristics that distinguish canonical from non-canonical manuscripts. The canonical ones are usually written in a more careful style, which points to their usage in public reading. A consistent usage of nomina sacra does occur only in the canonical manuscripts, whereas non-canonical texts rather use the nomina sacra randomly as abbreviations, for example, Papyrus Oxyrhynchus I and Papyrus Egerton II. It is also noteworthy that canonical manuscripts are always codices, whereas several of the non-canonical fragments mentioned above belonged to rolls. Another factor might be the date of origin. If Christian communities emerged from the second half of the 1st century onwards, the stories of Jesus that they could use were those of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, if we follow the traditional dating of these Gospels roughly between 70 and 100 CE. When the other Gospels were composed, there were already written accounts about Jesus that served as a basis for reception of a Jesus tradition in the emerging church. This would also explain why early theologians, as Irenaeus or Clement of Alexandria, regarded it as necessary to bring them in agreement with each other and to explain why the church possesses exactly these 4 Gospels, no more, no less. If we take these findings seriously, it could also mean that the church does not rely on the 4 Gospels because they are more serious, more historical, or even more authentic than the non-canonical writings. Even if that may be the case from a modern perspective, it was probably not the reason that led to their selection as the formative basis for the Jesus tradition. This could imply that the non-canonical writings should be regarded as writings that have much to contribute to the spectrum in which the Jesus tradition was preserved, transmitted, and interpreted in early Christianity, even if from a strictly canonical tradition of the church. But the boundaries between them and the canonical Gospels might not have been as strong as they might appear from a perspective of printed Bibles containing all 4 canonical Gospels. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much for this rich paper, and thank you very much for exactly remaining in the time. So we have half an hour for questions, remarks, discussion, etc., etc. Floor is open. Thomas, Kraus?
Thank you very much indeed for your mind-provoking paper. Raises a lot of questions or comments. I'm very happy about that you try to get rid of that dichotomy that canonical gospels versus non-canonical gospel competition. That's what I appreciate very much. Also with your conclusions and results, I can really sign my name underneath them. I want to add 2 comments and then raise a question, which I'm not sure whether, I have no idea how to understand that. The first thing is about the Gospel of Mary. You mentioned that one of the Greek manuscripts is written on a roll or a roll fragment, right? Maybe to the peculiarity of that testimony, the Rylands manuscript is a miniature codex, with pagination 2122. That means that this was a longer, small book. And that also refers that its owner or user had a certain tie to that manuscript. So this makes it the witnesses even more peculiar than it is now with that. So I will come to talk about this tomorrow. The second thing, you brought some details about soteriology, soter in the Gospel of Thomas. Also mentioned it referring to the Gospel of Mary. An interesting fact is that the two Greek manuscripts have soter written in full. So it's not abbreviated, whereas anthropos, anon, is written as a nomen sacrum. Maybe that's also adding to that point that the soteriology in that manuscript, or in the two manuscripts, was regarded as something just natural, something extraordinary. With that title, I come to my question that I don't want to give a co-paper anyway, because I cannot do that. On page 6 of your manuscript, you've referred to the titles, the title gospel. You say first from the variety of writings containing the title gospel at their beginning or at their end, it becomes clear that this title was used in a very broad sense and not for a specific literary genre, and so on and so on and so on. The point I want to raise here is that the smaller fragments coined or identified or edited as non-canonical Gospels do not contain any title. It's just a product of editions. Juan might know what I'm talking about. Also, the Gospel of Peter does not contain any title. Which non-canonical Gospels do you refer to here? What do you compare the canonical manuscripts with their titles, which came up with? Of course, we have manuscripts with non-canonical text, but maybe you can clarify that. Which, or what do you understand by title gospel here?
Yes, thank you, Thomas. Thank you for the two comments. And regarding your question, that the title Gospel According to, so Evangelion Kata, existed already at an early stage and was used also for other Gospels when those that eventually made it into the New Testament is, of course, if you look at the manuscript evidence, it is a bit difficult because the manuscripts that we have are later, from 4th century. But one could refer to some evidence from the church fathers, from early theologians, which mention exactly this title. For example, in this letter of Serapion, the phrase Evangelion Kata Petron appears, and also Clement refers to a gospel according to the Egyptians and a gospel according to the Hebrews. And there are also some other, I think Origin as well. Also, yeah, Origin also refers to Evangelion Kata Petron. So it, of course, it is. There's no clear evidence, no clear manuscript evidence for the use or usage of that title in the 2nd century. But it is quite probable that this title was also used for other Gospels than the 4 Gospels from this. From these remarks. So.
Other questions or remarks? If not yet, oh, of course, first you please, and then Armand Puig.
Thank you very much for your excellent paper. Well, I'm working in Islamic tradition, and the logia that we find in Islamic tradition. And most of the logia of Jesus, saying of Jesus that we find in Islamic tradition, they come from the apocryphal tradition. And well, my question is if some of these texts are interpreted in a mystical way in the apocryphal tradition. I mean, for instance, some texts of the Gospel of the Arab, or the one of St. James, that we can find, and in some others, we can find very, very strange passages where we find a Jesus child that doing something, several things that can instruct us now. But because I found that in Islamic tradition, especially the Sufi tradition, they have interpreted some of these passages in a mystical way. For instance, the text that we find in the Quran, that the miracle of the birds, Jesus making birds.
It's also in the infancy gospel.
Yes, in the infancy gospel, yes. So this one have been interpreted in Islamic tradition, in the Sufi tradition, as Jesus, as he's a spirit coming from God. He has the spirit of life, and that's why he's blowing into the birds, and he's giving the life to these birds, as God gave the life to Adam. So Jesus is doing as he was a little bit like God. He's the theophany of God in this moment. And also we find, for instance, Jesus speaking when he's a child, when he's a baby. We have this miracle in the Islamic tradition, and it has been also interpreted as that as Jesus, as he's the word of a word coming from God, so he has the power to speak, the power of the word, and that's why he's able to speak when he's just a child. Well, my question is there any mystical interpretation of all this kind of text that we find in the apocryphal Gospels, or these texts are just stories about Jesus?
Of course, the range of the so-called non-canonical Gospels, if we just make that distinction between canonical and non-canonical Gospels and not use the term apocryphal for the moment, then, of course, there are much more non-canonical Gospels than those which I have referred to here. And among them, also these infancy Gospels, which are full of legends about Jesus the child and so on. And these writings fill in gaps that are left by the older canonical Gospels, because they do not tell us very much about the young Jesus. Or that gap is used already early in the 2nd century by the infancy Gospel of James, so-called Prot-Evangelium of James, which is more about Mary than about Jesus, but it's also about this earthly stage of Jesus, so to speak, and then also by the other infancy Gospels. And I have left out that here because my question was which Gospels were, or which of these Gospels could be regarded as perhaps rivals or other interpretations of Jesus' figure besides the 4 Gospels that were regarded by early Christian theologians as the authoritative testimony about Jesus. And in that regard, these other interpretations of Jesus's teaching and the meaning of a Jesus figure are more interesting than these stories that we find in the infancy gospels. Of course, these infancy gospels were very widespread, and they had a great meaning and importance for the Christian tradition about Jesus, and they were received in Christian legions and in art and so on. But this was not my focus here. Here I wanted to ask which interpretation of Jesus's, of the person of Jesus and his teaching and his activity were regarded or were just existent in the 2nd and 3rd century. And it is, I think, that situation that we have in the 2nd and 3rd century, that there were different perspectives on Jesus. And what is quite interesting is that out of such a situation of different perspectives on Jesus, the unity of 4 narratives about Jesus were maintained by theologians, and they came up with thesis or the postulate that only these 4 Gospels form the authoritative basis about Jesus for the church. And that is a quite striking fact, I think. It is not at all self-evident why they came up with these 4 Gospels. It could have been 3, it could have been 1, it could have been 5 or whatever. So, and I think this, if you ask that question, there are several Gospels that are interesting to take into account. For example, these 3 that I have mentioned here, but there could be also others. But I would say this, what you mentioned now, these more legendary accounts are not so important in this discussion. They are interesting, of course, for the reception of a Jesus figure as well, but they are not rivals to the 4 Gospels as the authoritative narratives or accounts about Jesus in the New Testament.
So there is, as far as I see, another question by Armand Butch.
Many thanks, Jens, for your stimulating and insightful contribution. I think that I found my related your concept of creative reinterpretation to my own paper yesterday, and I feel really comfortable with that. Yeah. Also with the 2nd century datation. Yeah, I think that it is true that all those apocryphal Gospels, at least in the according to the text we have now, must be traced back to the 2nd century, not before. I mean, it is rather impossible, although we have the traditions. Yeah, but when we compare the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary, this is the first point I would like to make here. In the page 14, for instance, you are saying that in the Gospel of Mary, yeah, Jesus is presented as coming from the upper world and returning to it after his resurrection. Well, in the Gospel of Thomas, there are some expressions related to that, and also to a concept of creation. I mean, as the cosmos, yeah, as the all, yeah. This concept of all, it's not related to as the reality was a kind of reality embedded by God's presence, or by divine presence, not God's, by divine presence. And even the subject of the hidden message and so on. So I don't see so many differences between the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary in some in some aspects. I would like to, if you can fix a little bit more the differences between the theology of Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary, because I see them in, at least in the what I would call the second stage of Thomas, very close to that of the Gospel of Mary. And my second question would be, in the letter of Serapion to community of Rossos, the point is that the contents of this Gospel of Peter, of course, the title, Gospel of Peter, is very impressive. Gospel and Peter, so no question. But what provoked the rebuke from Serapion was the contents. I mean, why had Serapion to forbid the public reading of a very impressive document, Gospel of Peter, unless he had some fixed sound ups about its contents? So, because at the end, this question of on the formative, Christianity. So perhaps I would stress more the importance of the contents in the case of the apocryphal Gospels. Thanks.
Thank you, Armand. To your first question, I would say, of course, there are some points of contact or some analogies or similarities between the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Thomas, but there are also differences. And I would say the differences, the context and the differences are not bigger than, for example, between the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Thomas. One point of difference, for example, is that in the Gospel of Mary, we have this account about the soul going up to heaven. And but the way to salvation obviously is that the soul is detached from the human body. So that is a philosophical concept, a Platonic, obviously a middle Platonic concept, that there is mixture between the divine and the earthly realm, between matter and soul. And this has to be detached in order to find the way back to the true origin of a human being. And this is explained in detail in A Vision to Mary in the Gospel of Mary. So that is a very explicit anthropology in the Gospel of Mary that we do not have in that explicit way in the Gospel of Thomas. So I would say in the Gospel of Thomas, the philosophical or mythological background is much more in the background than it is made explicit. So, and I think it's always dangerous to read too much of philosophical or mythological stuff into such a writing when it is not there. So I would therefore say the writing as the Gospel of Mary and also the Apocryphon of John and some others go much more in the direction to interpret the Christian message or the Jesus figure within a concept of Platonic philosophy than the Gospel of Thomas does. The Gospel of Thomas refers to Jesus, and sometimes it sounds as if the Gospel of Thomas narrates episodes from the earthly Jesus. And this is an important difference in my view, and therefore I'm in favor of translating the Pace Jesus as Jesus says, because it is not it's not important for the Gospel of Thomas to make a difference between the earthly Jesus and the resurrected Jesus or the exalted Jesus, but it is Jesus who says or who does something. And therefore, I would say the main difference between these two writings is that the Gospel of Thomas is much more interested in presenting something about the teaching of Jesus, even of the earthly Jesus, whereas the Gospel of Mary is much more interested in a philosophical concept about the origin of humankind, the nature of humankind, and the way back to the divine origin, the way of a human being back to his or her divine origin. I think this is the difference. It is interesting that some writings, and you have that also in the writings of early Christian theologians, that some of them are much more interested in interpreting the Christian message against the background of Platonic philosophy. That is obviously the case with Origen and Clement of Alexandria and some others. And writings as the Gospel of Mary are examples for that the Jesus teaching or the narrative about Jesus could also be presented in such a way. So I would mention that as a main difference. And your other question concerning the letter of Serapion, I would say it is not mainly the content of the Gospel of Peter. Serapion explicitly says that most of it agrees with the teaching of our Savior, and there are some aspects in which the Gospel of Peter does not agree. And I will mention it below, but unfortunately, Eusebius does not transmit what Serapion mentioned as the disagreements between the Gospel of Peter and the content of the teaching of Jesus. But if we interpret the letter of Serapion, it is quite clear that the content of the Gospel of Peter was not the main point for the refusal or for the rejection of it, but the main issue was that it caused heresy, that it caused animosity within the community of Rossos. It caused separation within the community. That was the main concern of Serapion, that there were some people who came up with that, and these were people of the same group, which, as Serapion says, that we call Docetists. So whatever the relationship between the Gospel of Peter and these Docetists may have been, that is quite difficult to say, because from the Achmin fragment you cannot define anything as a specific docetic perspective on Jesus. There's, I would say, nothing in it. But the very interesting fact from that letter is that the main concern was the separation within the community that was caused by the reading of that gospel, and obviously not the content.
If there is not a direct question, I'm burning to put myself on the list of speakers. Yeah, the first. Oh, sorry. Then first, perhaps myself as a comment and a question which relates to what Armand was saying and what you were saying at the moment. First, a comment to the thesis that the canonical Gospels were more widespread than the non-canonical ones. I would agree in a certain sense for many of the texts, but I would not agree for the Gospel of Mark. If you say the Gospel of Mark in pre-Constantinian times, two fragments, then you can compare. That's difficult, I would say. And if you say that if you do not just concentrate on Gospels, you can say the Pastor Herme is much more widespread than Revelation in early times. So this is, in parts, I would say, for Matthew, this is absolutely the case. I would also say, perhaps this is the canonical Gospel. Okay, and the other part is in how far does the question whether special texts are used by special groups. So we have partly responded to this question as well. Is a problem. I would read Serapion also in the way that the main argument is that as long as he is in Rossos, he thinks, oh, it's more or less okay. And when he comes home, he hears, oh, this gospel is used by the Docetists. It must be dangerous. And now I'm looking for things which are dangerous. And if you look at John, which is used by the Valentinians, and some people start to say, oh, it is used by the wrong people. Is this also a point in between, or would you regard this as a point of secondary importance? So I don't have a clear answer for myself.
In principle, I would say it is for early theologians, it is a general problem that certain gospels were circulating and they were used by certain groups or individuals to come up with a specific view on Jesus, and that caused disagreement or disturbance or conflict within communities. I would say that is one, not the only one, but this is one problem why the theologians of the second and early third century regarded it as necessary to emphasize the unity of the four Gospels. So that is very interesting that Irenaeus regards it as necessary to emphasize the unity of the four Gospels against the usage of other Gospels, but also against the usage of just one of them. He is also against the usage of just one. And this is that would be the answer to your other question, or to the second part of your question. It is also problematic if certain groups, as for example the descendants of Valentinus, use one gospel, the Gospel of John, and interpret it in a specific way. And for these guys like Irenaeus and Origen and so on, it was very important that these four gospels interpret each other, so to speak, and that in this way they also confirm the teaching of a church or the creed of a church and so on. And I think it is, we had that already yesterday in the discussion with Christoph Markschies, it is a theological argument that you can come up with these four gospels, and if you interpret them together as the testimony of, or as the true testimony, or as the decisive testimony of a church, then they would present a certain perspective on Jesus, and would by the same time exclude other interpretations of Jesus' meaning. So I would say it is not, one should not isolate one of these arguments, but I think there are several arguments that were of importance for the establishment of the four gospel collection. So, and the use of one gospel that was also part of the four gospel collection was one of the problems that that these theologians like Irenaeus were facing.
Thank you for this very clear answer, and sorry for having overlooked you.
You already asked my question.
Okay. So then even more sorry. Yeah, I think there is, we are absolutely in time. It's exactly 5 o'clock. So this is German. This is Germany for all of you. We have now break, half an hour. Thank you very much for your wonderful paper. Thank you very much for this discussion, and see you all in half an hour. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, we come to the second paper of this afternoon. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Francis Watson. Francis Watson is a research professor of New Testament at the University of Durham, United Kingdom. He's an internationally well-known specialist on the Gospels. He has just published, I think, 1 year ago, a little bit more than 1 year ago, a volume of, I think, 700 pages or something like that. So a weighty and important volume on the Gospel writings, a canonical perspective. And I think this will be a must reading for anybody who is interested in Gospel research, at least for the next years to come. He is editor of perhaps the most important journal in the world of New Testament studies. Perhaps there are others. The New Testament studies, and he's currently working on perhaps one of the most difficult topics in early Christian studies, research on the so-called diatessaron, gospel harmony from the 2nd century. And I'm looking forward very much to hear what you have to say about these texts.
Is that better? That sounds better. Yes, good. I will try to speak slowly because I know that it is difficult to hear in this room. I hope you have copies of my paper. You have the full text. I think you all have that. I will not read the paper in full, but I will tell you when I'm intending to move on to another section of the paper. We have heard many times already at this conference of the Four Gospel collection, how by the beginning of the 3rd century, the later part of the 2nd century, this collection is separating itself out from all the other gospel texts that are in circulation, and beginning to form what we have known ever since as the fourfold gospel. But in Jens Schröter's paper, we were reminded that other gospel literature, so-called apocryphal or simply non-canonical gospel literature, continued to circulate and to be popular. So this already raises questions about quite how well established the Four Gospel collection was, and about how these non-canonical traditions were understood in relation to the Four Gospel collection. So the apocryphal Gospels, so-called, continue to raise questions about just why it was that so many early readers of Gospel literature felt that they had to go outside the Church's official canon, go beyond it. And I want to raise in this paper another complicating factor, and it is connected with the work that has been known ever since Eusebius, in his church history, as the diatessaron. In Eusebius and in the Greek and Latin world of the Mediterranean, the diatessaron was always understood as a so-called gospel harmony, an attempt to combine the narratives of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John into a single narrative, and in that way provide a useful supplement to the four separate Gospels which retained their authoritative status. What I would like to focus on in this presentation is the way in which this text, the so-called diatessaron, operated for 2 centuries or more in a Syriac context, in which the name, the diatessaron, was apparently unknown. It was not regarded as a gospel harmony. It was referred to simply as the gospel. So it is not the case that the four gospels, the fourfold gospel, is the canonical form of the gospel in an early Syriac context. Only from the 5th century onwards do the separated gospels begin to overtake the Diatessaron gospel in the Syriac world. So the Diatessaron is an interesting test case of a gospel text which is, of course, very closely similar to our familiar four Gospels, but nevertheless is very significantly different from our Gospels, both in its format and to some extent in its wording, insofar as we can recover that wording. So I will start reading from the second page, the first main section entitled Title and Sources. The so-called Diatessaron receives its familiar title from a reference in Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, where it is said that Tatian composed, I do not know how, a combination and compilation from the Gospels, named it the Diatessaron, which is still extant among some. In itself, Diatessaron appears to mean in fourfold form. Literally, it looks like through four, but evidence, which I won't go into now, implies that this expression simply means that this is the gospel in fourfold form without defining that form any more closely. The Greek title was not known to Syriac Christians, so Eusebius's Syriac translator has to explain it as best he can. Eusebius was translated into Syriac and Latin at a very early stage, within the 4th century. Tatian, according to the Syriac version of Eusebius, collected and connected and composed the gospel and called it Diatessaron, that is, of the connected, the mechalete, and it is extant among many to this day. Says the Syriac translator, referring to his own situation where this gospel is extant among many. In both recensions of the old Syriac gospels, the Sinaitic and the Curetonian, the individual texts are collectively known as Evangelion de Mepharishe, Gospel of the Separated. In these matching formulations, Evangelion de, Gospel of, corresponds to the Greek Euangelion kata, and the connected and the separated are the evangelists Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Where there is no need to differentiate the two formats, the composite work is simply the gospel for early Syriac authors such as Aphrahat and Ephraim. These writers say nothing of any link to Tatian, and they do not regard the work as a gospel harmony. For them, it is simply the gospel itself in its comprehensive and definitive form. So I will refer to this work here as, well, DE in the printed version. I'll call it the Diatessaron Gospel, to differentiate it from its subsequent conversion into a gospel harmony entitled the Diatessaron. Early evidence of this gospel version is preserved in a Greek fragment from Europos, a famous archaeological site which I believe is now in the hands of Islamic State, and in Syriac texts, above all, Ephraim's gospel commentary. Late versions are preserved in Latin and Arabic translations. So first of all, Greek gospel fragment was discovered during excavations at Dura Europos on the Euphrates in 1933, in which statements about the women at the crucifixion and Joseph of Arimathea have been compiled from phraseology taken from all four canonical Gospels. The manuscript must predate 256 CE, the year in which the city was destroyed by Shapur I of Persia. So it's a very early piece of Diatessaron manuscript. Comparison with the equivalent passages in the later Latin and Arabic versions makes an identification with the Diatessaron virtually certain, strengthening the case for a Greek original. Those points are contested, but I think they are conclusive. The most distinctive feature of this short text is its statement that the women among those who followed him from Galilee stood at a distance to see the crucified one, not an expression we have in that form in any of the canonical texts. Secondly, and much more importantly, Ephraim's commentary on the Gospel preserves evidence of the wording and sequence of the Syriac Diatessaron in its mid-4th century form. Ephraim's work became known to Western scholars when an Armenian translation was published in 1836. This was followed by the publication of much of the original Syriac in 1963, with a further installment in 1990. Of particular interest are points where Ephraim attests divergences from the individual Gospels which have been eliminated from the later Latin and Arabic editions. Thus, supplementary narrative details occur at Jesus' baptism, where the descent of the Spirit is accompanied by a light shining on the water, and on the occasion of Jesus' visit to Nazareth, when the hostile crowd actually succeed in throwing him over a cliff, only to find that he does not fall but flies. He glides down to Capernaum gracefully. There are also a number of convergences between Ephraim's text and readings specific to the Old Syriac of the separate Gospels, as attested in the Sinaitic and Kiritonian manuscripts. These texts have evidently been influenced by the Diatessaron Gospel, and it's sometimes plausible to speculate about Diatessaronic readings preserved in them, even where these cannot be confirmed from elsewhere. The third piece of evidence for the Diatessaron Gospel is a Latin translation of the Diatessaron included in the 6th century Codex Fuldensis, manuscript of the whole New Testament, prepared by Bishop Victor of Capua. But instead of the separate Gospels, he has what seems to be the Diatessaron, in the form of a new edition of an older Latin text, which probably goes back to a Greek original. The composite Gospel text occurs in the context of a single-volume edition of the New Testament and seems intended to reopen the question of the appropriate form of the canonical Gospel. Its editor, Victor of Capua, describes this Gospel text not as a Diatessaron, but as a Diapente, perhaps because he wishes it to take its place as a 5th Gospel alongside the canonical 4. Victor is aware of Tatian's reputation as a heretic, but states in his preface that Tatian provided the learned with a text that is not without value, compiling a gospel characterized, in my view, by its skillfully constructed connections. For Victor, the importance of the connections is that they supposedly restore an accurate historical sequence to the events of Jesus' life. Victor also preserves an older Latin list of capitula or chapter titles, which open with John 1:1-5. So the opening of the Diatessaron before Victor gets hold of it is with the beginning of John's Gospel. Victor inserts Luke 1:1-4, which the earlier version omitted. The Latin text is assimilated to Jerome's Gospel edition, which is becoming authoritative in the 6th century. While the non-canonical details extant in Ephraim's day have been removed, other aspects of Tatian's redactional procedures remain intact. Thus, the Lucan account of Jesus' inaugural sermon in Nazareth is divided into 2 widely separated halves, the first narrating the positive reception that Jesus received at the start of his ministry, the second, a negative reception at a point when his Capernaum-based ministry was already established. So he divides the passage in Luke chapter 4 about Jesus' visit to Nazareth into the positive first half of that story, which comes early in Jesus' ministry. The negative second part of that story is placed at a much later date. Since this division also occurs in the Arabic translation as well as the Latin one, it's likely to go back to Tatian himself. And fourthly, in our little survey of early evidence about the Diatessaron, a preface to one of the two recensions of the Arabic Diatessaron, dating from around the 11th century, indicates that this is the work of the priest Abdul Faraj Abdullah ibn Taib, who translated it from the Syriac, and that, I quote from the preface, the holy gospel and beautiful garden known as Diatessaron, they don't know what that word means, the same, was originally compiled by Titianos the Greek. An attempt is given to explain the strange foreign title. The explanation of this term is by for. A colophon identifies the Syriac editor as the 9th century lexicographer Isa ibn Ali. As the Latin of Victor of Capua's version has been assimilated to Jerome, so the Syriac underlying the Arabic has been assimilated to the Peshitta. Both editors key their composite texts to the separate Gospels. Victor adapts the Eusebian canon tables. Isa ibn Ali distributes the abbreviations M, R, Q, and H throughout the text. That's M for Matthew, R, the second consonant in Mark, Q for Luke, and H or H for John, indicating an origin in Matthew the elect, Mark the chosen, Luke the favored, and John the beloved, respectively. In these later formats, the Diatessaron has become a gospel harmony because it's linked so closely back to these separate gospels, subordinate to the canonical four rather than a gospel, or rather the definitive gospel in its own right. I'm suggesting, therefore, that this work originally functions in the Syriac context as the gospel. It just is the gospel text. It's definitive. In a later context where the four separate gospels are widely established, even in the Syriac-speaking world, it is converted into a gospel harmony. But that is not what it was in the time of Ephraim in the 4th century. I have 3 sections which are giving illustrations from the early part of the Diatessaron Gospel of ways in which this text appears to have differed from the familiar texts of the separated Gospels. I think I will not read the first of these sections on the Johannine prologue, but we might just look, page 6 of the shorter version of the paper, the one without footnotes that most people have, to see the text as I have reconstructed this from Ephraim. So DE reads as follows: Ho gegonen en auto, that seems to be a self-contained statement. That which has come to be was in him. And then a separate statement, kai autos zoe estin, and he is life. And then thirdly, kai aute he zoe, and the life itself is the light of humans. And then the light was shining in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. So some work has been done on the verbs there to, for example, to ensure that the verb referring to the light shining is in the past tense, just like the reference to the darkness not overcoming it. The light was shining in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. I think that is Tatian adapting the text that he reads in his Johannine source text and making it read more logically. That then is the text that Ephraim comments on. More striking, however, is the fact that instead of continuing, as we might assume, with the so-called Johannine prologue, we then shift from John over to Luke. And so the Diatessarontic Gospel states that the light was shining in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. In the days of Herod, king of Judah, there was a priest, etc. Now we, of course, immediately notice, if we're familiar with the Gospels at all, that this is a shift from John to Luke. But of course, if you don't know the separate Gospels, you don't notice that shift at all. So we will come on to my section 3, Zechariah the priest, on page 7 of the shorter version of my paper, the one without footnotes. My colleagues have a more complicated version with all the footnotes. So it's a different page number for them. Zechariah the priest. The transition from the light that the darkness did not overcome to Herod, king of Judah, and the priest Zechariah may seem abrupt. That was not the view of Ephraim, according to whom, I quote from Ephraim, the evangelist begins to say of the one whom the darkness did not overcome, it came to pass in the days of Herod, king of Judah. He doesn't notice any transition there. For him, there's a smooth shift from the darkness and the light to the days of Herod, king of Judah. Ephraim here shows no interest in either the evangelist's sources or his identity. He refers simply to the evangelist. Knowing as we do that the evangelist was most probably Tatian and that his sources were John and Luke, it's possible to probe a little further into the logic of this transition. In John 1:6, the verse after the one about the light shining in the darkness, we learn that there came a man sent from God whose name was John. In the following verses, John is presented as witness to the light, and these verses, John 1:7 and 8, will later make possible a skillfully constructed transition that Tatian makes between the Lucan introduction to the ministry of John the Baptist and the remainder of the Johannine prologue. So I'm jumping forward beyond the infancy narratives to the beginning of the ministry of John the Baptist, which of course leads to the ministry of Jesus. It's at this point that Tatian places what we regard as the second major part of the prologue of St. John's Gospel. So here's what you might have heard if you had attended a church in the Syriac-speaking region with Ephraim all ready to preach his homily. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, etc., all those other names are mentioned, the word of God came to John the son of Zechariah in the wilderness, and he went into all the region about the Jordan, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. As it is written in the book of the words of Isaiah the prophet, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, and so on. And all flesh shall see the salvation of God. We recognize that as Luke's introduction to the ministry of John the Baptist. We read on, he came for testimony, to bear witness to the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness to the light. The true light that enlightens every man was coming into the world. So once again, a moment of transition, which we notice, because we know the difference between Luke and John, which we assume Ephraim and his congregations would just have been entirely unaware of. The Luke-John transition here is a mirror image of the John-Luke transition with which this gospel opens. John 1:1-5 introduces the Lucan account of the birth of John the Baptist. John 1:7-18 follows Luke's account of the beginning of his appears to have been omitted. For Tatian, the statement that there came a man sent from God whose name was John may have seemed no more than a brief and redundant summary of the Lucan birth narrative, which recounts at length how John came into the world, sent by God and heralded by an angel, and how he received his name, John. It's all explained, of course, in Luke chapter 1. The transition from John 1:1-5 to Luke 1:5-80 is simply an elaboration of the transition from John 1:5 to John 1:6 that Tatian found in his Johannine source. If Ephraim's citations are correct, Tatian's introduction to Zechariah and Elizabeth omitted 3 Lucan references to Zechariah and Elizabeth's priestly antecedents and their Mosaic piety. And I've quoted Luke 1, 5-6 in the text. The underlined passages are the ones which I believe that Tatian left out. So here's Luke. There was in the days of Herod, king of Judea, a certain priest, and his name was Zechariah, of the division of Abijah, and his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless. It seems that the Deuteronomic gospel used by Ephraim had a different version of that passage, with the underlined passages omitted. There was in the days of Herod, king of Judea, a certain priest, and his name was Zechariah, and his wife was Elizabeth, and they were both righteous before God, blameless in all their conduct. It is possible, but unlikely, that it is Ephraim rather than Tatian who has omitted Luke's Jewish references. Blameless in all their conduct is probably a substitute for walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless, Luke's version, rather than an addition. Luke 1:6 in the Sinaitic Syriac would then be a harmonization of Luke and the Deuteronomic gospel. And they were both righteous before God, and they were walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, and they were blameless in all their conduct. So that seems to combine the original Luke text with the Deuteronomic reference to blameless in all their conduct. If the Deuteronomic gospel is removed, well, have removed others. What has been removed is a specific reference to the law of Moses, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord. This has been replaced by a more general reference to Elizabeth and Zechariah being blameless in all their conduct. So a distinctively Jewish reference is omitted and a more general reference is substituted. Luke's reference to Zechariah's origins, ex ephemerias abia, from the division of Abijah, displays and is intended to display an impressively precise knowledge of the scriptural institution of priesthood. When he adds that Elizabeth too was of priestly origin, the daughters of Aaron, and that both of them knew and scrupulously observed all the requirements of the law of Moses, the effect is to set the birth of John and indirectly of Jesus in a highly particularistic, very specific Jewish context. Tatian ascribes to Zechariah and Elizabeth a more generic piety, a more general, not specifically Jewish. He does not expect his readers to show an interest in the finer points of priestly genealogy, and he does not suppose that the Mosaic law is an essential prerequisite for a righteous life. The human sphere that corresponds to the divine sphere of the Logos is still recognizably Jewish, but its Jewishness has lost its sharply defined boundaries. This erasing of Jewish particularities, of Jewish features, continues in Tatian's rendering of Zechariah's temple vision, if Ephraim can be relied upon, and if they're Deuteronomic. Here is Luke's account of Zechariah's vision in the temple. It speaks of him entering the temple of the Lord, and all the multitude of the people were praying outside at the hour of incense. Again, I've underlined the passages which change in Tatian. There appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing at the right of the altar of incense. And he was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer is heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John." There are subtle changes to this in what appears to have been Tatian's version. "And when he entered the temple, the multitude of the people were standing and praying at the hour of worship. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing to the right of the troubled and confused when he saw the angel, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, 'Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for behold, God has heard the voice of your prayer, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John.'" According to Ephraim, John's birth was announced from the right of the altar. I should have underlined that, but I haven't done so. Never mind. John's birth was announced from the right of the altar. It took place at the hour of prayer when petitions are made. Luke's references to the hour and the altar of incense are missing here, and their absence probably goes back to Tatian. Zechariah enters the temple not to offer incense, but to pray, together with the multitude of the people who are standing and praying within the temple, not outside it, as in Luke. Zechariah here participates in congregational prayer and worship rather than performing the specifically priestly rite of offering incense. His prayer, however, is offered in the Holy of Holies, from where he emerges dumb to the congregation gathered in the outer part of the temple building. What Zechariah prays for is a son, and the angel's reassurance, "God has heard the voice of your prayer," is therefore an instant answer to a prayer that has only just been made. In Luke 2, Zechariah is told that your prayer is heard. Yet, while the people outside are said to be praying, Zechariah's role is not to pray, but to offer incense. Again, Luke displays precise knowledge of scripturally based custom. There are Pentateuchal specifications for an altar of incense located outside the Holy of Holies, on which the priest is to burn incense morning and evening. There is then no real connection in Luke between the occasion, the offering of an answer to prayer. It is left to the reader to conclude that Zechariah must be this occasion that is left unspecified. Tatian seems to have addressed this anomaly, this problem, by eliminating the references to incense and by inventing a special hour of worship or prayer to serve as an appropriate setting for Zechariah to pray for a son and to receive an instant response. The angelic response is expanded, underlining its importance in Tatian's rendering of this narrative. God has heard the voice of your prayer. In Luke 1:13, it said only that, dioti esakuste hede esis su, therefore your prayer is heard. Tatian's expanded version echoes Psalm 65:19. God has heard the voice of your prayer. I've underlined the relevant Greek words there. Esekusen hotheos tephonetes deesios mu. Or, well, su in Tatian's case. As in the Deuteronomy Gospel's version of Luke's introduction to Zechariah and Elizabeth, narrative detail even the high priest, but is placed within the Davidic ordering of priesthood. Zechariah and Elizabeth were right equivalent to their being blameless in all their conduct, rather than ordinances of the Lord. Rather than performing a distinctive priestly rite at the prescribed time and place, Zechariah offers the generic prayer of the childless within a specially constructed context. Fourthly, we move on to some details from Tatian's presentation of the figure of the Virgin Mary. First, I think, 3 examples. In the Diatessaron Gospel, the Lucan dialogue between Gabriel and Mary is modified at several points. Again, I've underlined them. And the angel said to her, "Fear not, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, in your virginity you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from sins. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of David his father, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." And Mary said to the angel, "How shall this be? For behold, no man has known me." Mary will conceive in her virginity. The addition, those words were not in Luke. The addition rules out a conclusion that might be drawn from the Diatessaron Gospel's Lucan source, that Mary receives the Annunciation as a betrothed virgin, but that she will presumably have lost her virginity when she conceives her child. In itself, "You will conceive in your womb and bear a son," does not adequately secure the miraculous event that it intends. In the Diatessaron Gospel's version, Mary's virginity extends explicitly not only to her conception, but also to her giving birth. Ephraim is familiar with the tradition that Mary gave birth in a cave near Bethlehem, and he probably knew the associated story of the midwife Salome, who discovers that Mary remained physically intact even after the birth. While it's unclear how far this material was represented in the Diatessaron Gospel, a virginal birth as well as conception is evidently in view here. Like the Diatessaron Gospel, the Protevangelium of James transfers the Matthean explanation of Jesus' name, "for he will save his people from their sins," into a Lucan context. So there's the Matthean version. "She will bear a son, and you will call his name Jesus, for autos soseton laon autou apoton hamartion auton," he will save his people from their sins. Luke simply has, "and she will bear a son, and you will call his name Jesus." Protevangelium speaks of the power of God overshadowing you. Therefore, what is born from you will be called holy, the Son of the Highest, and you will call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. So that little Matthean reference to Jesus saving his people from their sins has been transferred into the Protevangelium's version of the Lucan Annunciation story. And something similar happens in the case of the Diatessaron Gospel. "You will bear a son, and you will call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." Tatian has probably derived his version of this from Justin, because Justin has already made that move. The angel said to the virgin, "And you will call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." So again, the Matthean phrase is introduced into the Lucan account of the Annunciation to Mary by the angel Gabriel. I think we'll move on there to the second point at the bottom of the page, negotiating the transition from the Lucan to the Matthean annunciational skills of the evangelist redactor. The Matthean annunciation is, of course, an annunciation of an angel in a dream to Joseph, giving him the news and explaining why it is that his fiancée is pregnant. And getting from Luke to Matthew is the problem that Tatian faces. In Luke, the aftermath of the Annunciation is celebratory. Mary visits Elizabeth and Zechariah. She is welcomed with a prophetic acclamation. She sings her own song of triumph, and then after 3 months returns home. Having brought her back to Nazareth, the later evangelist, Tatian, now turns to another of his sources to learn what happened next. He reads in Matthew that Mary engaged to be with child of the Holy Spirit. This is indeed as one would expect after the 3 months referred to in Luke 1:56. The problem in the Matthew narrative is Mary's complete silence and passivity, which contrasts so sharply with Luke's portrayal. Matthew's Mary makes no attempt to explain her pregnancy to Joseph, exposing her engagement and her person to grave danger. The Matthean evangelist may reasonably take it for granted that a Mary who protested her innocence would hardly be believed. If Joseph is to be reassured, an angel is required. Yet, given the Diatessaron Gospel's use of its Lucan source, a silent and unprotesting Mary is unacceptable. It seems that it is Tatian as well as Ephraim who addresses the problem as follows. What follows here is my reconstruction from Ephraim of a particular point in the Diatessaron text, and the underlined sections are the sections which are not found in Luke or Matthew, and which I think Tatian has added. The birth of the Messiah was like this. When Mary was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child of the Holy Spirit. So far, that is familiar Matthew language. Mary assured Joseph that her conception was from the Spirit, but he did not accept it. And when he saw that her countenance was clear and her womb heavy, Joseph did not wish to denounce Mary being a just man. And then another addition, but he did not receive her as her husband, for he thought she had had intercourse with another. So in his righteousness he lamented that he could not take her, yet he did not denounce her. So he resolved to divorce her quietly. Therefore an angel appeared to him and said, Joseph's son of David, etc. And we're back on the familiar ground of the Matthean story. The underlined passage is introduced by the Syriac particle lam, apparently identifying it as a citation. Reference to Joseph's rejection of Mary's protestations contradicts Ephraim's own view, which is that it is inconceivable that he could have disbelieved her. The passage is therefore text rather than commentary, although Ephraim may here summarize a Diatessaron passage of dialogue and soliloquy. Passing over the parenthesis in the brackets, which may stem from Ephraim, the passage has been assembled by inserting two new elements, B1 and B2 in my layout here, into the Matthean source narrative. So you see that I've analyzed the passage I've just read into its Matthean and its Diatessaron elements, A1, when Mary was betrothed to Joseph, and so on. And the first addition, Mary assured Joseph that her conception was from the Spirit. A2, again, this is Matthew, Joseph did not wish to denounce Mary. B2, an addition to Matthew, but he did not receive her as her husband, for he thought she had had intercourse with another. A3, Matthew again, so he resolved to divorce her quietly. Here, B1 resolves the tension between Luke's active and vocal Mary and Matthew's passive and silent one. Mary did explain the truth of her situation, but was disbelieved. B2 clarifies Matthew's reference to the intended separation and makes still clearer the problem that the angelic vision is intended to solve. The author of the Proto-Evangelium of James faces exactly the same problem of creating a convincing transition between Luke and Matthew, but resolves it differently. Acclaimed by Elizabeth, as in Luke, Mary suffers a sudden, unexplained memory lapse and can no longer understand even her own Magnificat version of that transition from Luke to Matthew. But Mary forgot the mysteries the angel Gabriel had spoken. And she looked up to heaven and said, "Lord, who am I that all the women of the earth will bless me?" She suddenly doesn't understand who she is. And she passed 3 months with Elizabeth, and day by day her belly grew, and Mary returned home fearful and hid herself from the sons of Israel. As in the Diatessaron Gospel, the return home means a transition from the Lucan to the Matthean encounter with Joseph. This occurs in the 6th month of Mary's pregnancy, when Joseph returns from an extended period of building activity, notices her pregnancy, and without speaking to her, embarks on a grief-stricken monologue. "Who has done this wickedness in my house and defiled the Virgin?" Then the question is put to Mary. "Why have you humiliated your soul, you who were reared in the Holy of Holies and received food from the hand of an angel?" And she wept bitterly, saying, "I am pure, I have not known any man." And Joseph said to her, "So how did you get pregnant?" She said, "As the Lord lives, I do not know how it happened." So Joseph, weighing his options, decides on separation. Then the angel of the Lord appears to him in a dream, and he understands. In the Diatessaron Gospel's version of this train of events, as attested by Ephraim, the awkward and artificial memory lapse of the Protoevangelium has disappeared, and there is no abject confession of ignorance. Mary assured Joseph that her conception was from the Spirit, but he did not accept it. He is in the wrong, she is in the right. His slanderous accusation of adultery is in stark contrast to the acceptance Mary found with Anna and, it seems, with Zechariah. Here again is Ephraim quoting the Diatessaron Gospel. "Therefore the angel said to him, 'Do not fear to take Mary.' And again it is written, 'He was living with her chastely,' and so on. And therefore they killed Zechariah because he had accepted Mary in her virginity, for the virgins were gathered together in one place. Or it was when the children were being killed and his son was sought from his hand, and he made him flee to the wilderness, that they killed him at the altar, as our Lord said." Here Ephraim refers to 2 different accounts of the death of Zechariah. According to the first, Zechariah was put to death for acknowledging the virginity of Mary. The allusion is obscure, but it may indicate that the Diatessaron Gospel made at least passing reference to Zechariah's death. The second account corresponds exactly to the Protoevangelium, whose author assumes that Zechariah, the father of John, is also Zechariah, son of Berechiah, murdered between the sanctuary and the altar, according to Matthew 23 and Luke 11. Zechariah was put to death for failing to reveal his son's whereabouts, according to the Protoevangelium. There are then possible parallels between the Diatessaron Gospel and the Protoevangelium of James in accounts of Mary's confrontation with Joseph and the death of Zechariah. Indeed, the Protoevangelium of James may have provided the inspiration for this Diatessaronic material, although the later evangelist is more constrained by his Matthean and Lucan sources than is his predecessor. So then a third and final Mary-related a change that appears to have been made to Luke's text. In the flow of the Diatessaron Gospel's narrative, Mary's virginal conception initially gives rise to joy and praise in the home of Elizabeth and Zechariah. Subsequently, it becomes a scandalon, generating serious tensions as Mary returns to the home she shares with Joseph and occasioning Zechariah's martyrdom. The heightening of Mary's role in this retelling of the gospel story corresponds to a certain downgrading of Joseph's. In Matthew 1, Joseph and Mary each have distinct theological roles. Mary is the bearer of the miraculously conceived child, who is Emmanuel, God with us. Joseph is the descendant of David, who, in spite of the fatherless birth, secures for Jesus a messianic status as son of David. And he is also the descendant of Abraham, who integrates Jesus into the scriptural history of the people of Israel. Prior to the birth itself, announced in Matthew 2, verse 1, Joseph and Mary are carefully coordinated, one representing continuity with scriptural roots, the other the inbreaking of what is radically new. The symmetry between Joseph and Mary is already disturbed by Luke and disappears entirely in the Deuteronomy Gospel. In Luke, Joseph still retains his ancestral claim as son of David. Luke 2, 4 and 5 reads as follows, "And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, for he was of the house and family of David, to be enrolled with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child." The Deuteronomic Gospel reads as follows. This is attested in Ephraim and also in the Sinaitic Syriac. "And Joseph also was going up from Bethlehem, Paul's house of David, he and Mary, his wife, who was with child, to be enrolled." A statement about Joseph that as a member of the Davidic house, he provides the link with Bethlehem, the royal city, and with the Messiahship, is reapplied to both of them, he and Mary, his wife. In sharing Davidic status with Mary, Joseph effectively loses it. It's transferred to Mary. Thus, the Deuteronomic Gospel omits both the Matthean and the Lucan genealogies. For Luke follows Matthew in tracing Jesus' descent through a link to Joseph that does not actually exist. If Jesus is of the seed of David, it must be through Mary, his mother, for in spite of Matthew, a Davidic descent through Joseph is hard to understand. When Ignatius of Antioch speaks of Jesus Christ as of the family of David and of Mary, Joseph has already disappeared from view. In the Protevangelium, the child Mary is identified as one of the undefiled virgins from the tribe of David. According to Justin, Christ, the Son of God, existed before the morning star and the moon, and through this virgin born of the race of David, submitted to becoming flesh. The promised virgin who will conceive and bear a son has become a royal virgin. She shares in the Davidic ancestry that only Joseph possesses in Matthew and Luke, and it's in that way that Jesus is understood as son of David and as Messiah. So some very brief conclusions. Number one, the so-called Diatessaron was originally a gospel rather than a gospel harmony. Like earlier evangelists, its redactor avails himself of early sources and exercises a degree of critical freedom in his use of them. His overarching aim is to produce a singular, coherent, and definitive gospel book out of his plural and diverse sources. Point two, the redactor's repertoire of procedures includes emendation, changing the text, juxtaposition, moving the text around, omission, and elaboration, leaving things out, putting new things in. These are precisely the procedures that can be demonstrated or assumed in the case of earlier evangelists. 3, so taking those 4 points one by one: emendation, juxtaposition, omission, and elaboration. A source's wording may be amended in order to reduce apparent anomalies or achieve a new formulation of a substantive theological point. Tatian amends his Lucan source when he speaks of Mary as well as Joseph as being descended from David. Fourthly, since meaning is in part contextual, new meanings and significances are to be expected where an evangelist redactor has juxtaposed material from different sources, as when Tatian links the first few verses of John's Gospel directly to Luke's account of the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist. Juxtaposition of material from different sources. This is what evangelists do, and it is what Tatian did in this case. My fifth point, redactors are not obliged to make use of all available source material, even where they are striving for comprehensiveness. Some source material may therefore be omitted where it is deemed to be problematic or superfluous or unnecessary. So, for example, Luke famously misses out a large section of Mark's Gospel, which in general he follows very closely. Tatian misses out the genealogies he finds in Matthew's Gospel and in Luke's Gospel. He has no use for them, and he misses them out. In the same way, he omits the Lucan preface, the first few verses of Luke's Gospel. He can find no place for that. So he, like earlier evangelists, is capable of omitting material that isn't useful for him. By having a discussion between Joseph and Mary about how this has come about. And my seventh point, the final point, is that although late in relation to its individual sources, the Diatessaron Gospel nevertheless predates the full emergence of a fourfold gospel that guarantees the integrity of its individual components. Just explain that point. In one sense, the Diatessaron Gospel is late. It's later than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Tatian is writing maybe in the 160s. We conventionally place Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the last decades of the first century. So in that sense, the Diatessaron Gospel is late. My point here is that it precedes the clear formation of the four Gospel collection. So in relation to the four Gospel collection, it is actually earlier rather than being a late text. The Diatessaron Gospel still reflects the fluidity of the early phase of Gospel writing in which any one version of the Gospel can become a source for another. Thank you very much indeed.
So thank you very much for this fascinating material, and I'm sure this gives us a chance now to ask a lot of questions. There is around half an hour time for discussion now. So perhaps I may start, if you don't mind. So actually, I like your main thesis very much, so to say, that the Diatessaron is not something which is already a sign or a witness for a four gospel collection or even a four gospel canon. That's something like a gospel on its own. I would perhaps have a little bit of a question on the one hand regarding perhaps a question on the method of your diatessaron reconstruction, and perhaps then even the whole line is going into even later times. So what is the relation between the commentary of Ephraim? In one or two parts you say this is text, this is commentary, but it's not so absolutely clear. And then Ephraim's diatessaron and Tatian's diatessaron. Is this, for example, Ephraim is so much someone who is anti-Jewish? Couldn't it be that he introduced some of these anti-Jewish or non-Jewish readings or writings or so? Question mark.
Thank you. Yes, at each point, I have tried to show, it's largely in the footnotes, that the reading I'm proposing is more likely to come from Ephraim's gospel text than from Ephraim himself. You're absolutely right, this is a crucial methodological point, but it's no different to any other ancient commentary where the distinction between the text and the comment is usually fairly clear. It is usually indicated in one way or another by the commentator, and that's the case with Ephraim's commentary. So you're absolutely right, this is a methodological issue. One has to face it in every possible case. But if, for example, Ephraim offers a comment on a text of John 1:5, where the text reads, "The light was shining in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." If that is the text that Ephraim comments on, it is likely, surely, that that is his text. So I think in that case, it's reasonable to say that the Deuteronomic text, the light was shining in the darkness, which of course is quite different from the whole of the Greek manuscript tradition. Of course, we can't be sure that the text that in the 360s corresponds exactly to the text as compiled by Tatian maybe 200 years previously. And I would guess that the relationship between Tatian's work and the text that Ephraim had is just about the same as the relationship between Matthew's work and the text of Matthew used in the mid-4th century. There are going to be textual variants, but the text has not been completely changed into something else.
Armand? I think you're the first, at least I have seen you as the first person. Just start. Oh, please.
Many thanks, Francis, for your nice the rediscovering of this text and so on. Yeah, I'm wondering about the last statement, because do you suppose that this stage of fluidity between the texts of the Gospels, of course, we have some examples of that. For instance, the famous the sinner woman in John 8. Yeah, it is a clear case of several positions in different Gospels. There are some other, but would you consider this is a common case? This fluidity, we have some examples, but extent of that, yeah. And in this case, if the texts were kept perhaps in a very, I would say, in a rather convinced way, yeah, or this is not a right interpretation of that.
I The distinction I want to make with the Diatessaron is a distinction between a gospel harmony and a gospel. A gospel harmony is a text which acknowledges the authority, the canonical status of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A gospel is a text compiled out of sources which may well be quite significantly changed. And that is the case, I think, with the Diatessaron. So I am interested in analogies between, for example, Matthew's use of Mark and the Diatessaron's use of its own sources. So the techniques that I listed at the end of emendation, juxtaposition, omission, and elaboration, I think can be demonstrated from the Diatessaron, but in the same way they could be demonstrated from Matthew or Luke using Mark. So that's the type of fluidity that I have in mind. It's the term fluidity is intended to show that an evangelist will be dependent on earlier sources, but will exercise a degree of freedom in the way that he presents those earlier sources. So material can be added, it can be left out, you can switch it around, you can expand it or whatever. So fluidity is a term I'm using to try to capture that relationship of dependence and freedom in relation to earlier sources.
Thank you. I'm looking out for other questions and remarks. In this case, perhaps I may add another question. Perhaps to play a little bit the advocatus diaboli, if I don't want to, even if I don't want to do that. If I look, for example, at the Gospel of Peter, which has been discussed by Jens Schröter just a few moments ago, and if I look into the so-called unknown Gospel on Papyrus Egypt, at least I think we disagree in a few points regarding this text, would say these two texts are texts where I would say there are already Gospels around. It is necessary to presuppose that there is a Gospel of Matthew, that there is a Gospel of Luke, but I would think that a purely reduction critical approach would not help me very much to understand how these Gospels came into being, were originated. So I think the author of the Gospel of Peter is not somebody who says, okay, here is the Gospel of John and here is the Gospel of Mark and so on. But I would say he's someone who has these stories in mind and creates his story, which is the story. I think there is perhaps, at least from my perspective, a different degree regarding the Gospel Diatessaron. I think for the Diatessaron, you need really an author, as far as I understand it, who has these four Gospels as written sources in mind and uses different techniques to, so of course reductional techniques, but different techniques which have to do with written, with the compiling written sources. Would you say that this makes a difference, or is it just something like a question of degree of relating to other texts?
Yes, I think I agree with you. I mentioned a moment ago that the model I have in mind is one of, on the one hand, dependence, on the other hand, freedom. But of course, the balance between those two can be different in different cases. In some cases, the dependence includes a repetition of many of the original words of the source text. So this sometimes happens in the case of Matthew and Mark. It happens almost certainly much of the time in the case of Tatian. He's very much bound to the wording of the source text, although even there he does exercise freedom. In the case of the Gospel of Peter, there are many fewer verbal overlaps with the prior texts, but I'd still argue that the Gospel of Peter is
heavily dependent on, for example, Matthew's story of the guard at the tomb, or indeed Mark's story of the young man in the tomb. So there is still dependence on Matthew and Mark there, even though it's not necessarily dependence on the exact wording of Matthew and Mark. I agree with you. There is a difference between these texts. The Protevangelium, again, is much freer in its handling of Matthew and Luke's infancy stories than the Diatessaron. So I agree that there is a difference there.
Thank you, Francis. What do you think about the aim of the Diatessaron? So what was the intention to compose such a gospel? Would you say it is something in a canonical direction? So it wanted to make certain texts or traditions about Jesus, how to put that, as it wanted to emphasize the importance of certain texts and traditions about Jesus to make them meaningful for the church by composing that story of Jesus. And would that make a difference to some other gospels which rather tend to present new perspectives or a perspective or a different perspective on Jesus's activity or the meaning of his person or so? And would that be a rather different view what we have here in the Diatessaron, which mainly relies on traditions that were already present, that were already read in several communities and so on?
Thank you. I think that the aim of the Diatessaron Gospel was to present a single, definitive and comprehensive version of the Gospel story. I think the editor or evangelist, Tatian, who compiles it, is unsatisfied with the fact that there are many different texts out there, including the 4 canonical Gospels that we know as canonical, but others as well, and he wants a single text to represent the one authentic gospel of Jesus Christ. He wants it to be comprehensive in the sense that he wants to bring in everything that he regards as authentic tradition about Jesus, wherever it comes from. I assume that the original so-called Diatessaron included many more elements that were later identified as non-canonical than actually survive in the much later Arabic and Latin translations. We know of some of them from Ephraim. There's the well-known case of the light or fire descending on the Jordan at Jesus' baptism. There is also the case of Jesus being thrown off a cliff at Nazareth and flying down. He glides down miraculously. There are some other examples of traditions which seem to have been in the original Diatessaron, which were not preserved later. So his aim is to be comprehensive, but his aim at the same time is to produce a singular form of the gospel. He doesn't like plurality. In a certain sense, he can be compared with Marcion, I think. Marcion, in one way, is quite different. He wants a scaled down gospel, but he still wants a singular gospel. He just has this text, and in both Marcionite communities and in Syriac-speaking communities, the gospel text that they have is simply known as the gospel. It is not Marcion's gospel, it is not Tatian's gospel, it is the gospel, and it is a singular text. And I would think that from the perspective of these communities, the idea that there are plural gospels circulating elsewhere is a very problematic one, because a singular gospel is what these communities assumed was appropriate to the singular person of Jesus Christ and the singular truth of the message about him.
Thank you. So when you would say the aim or the intention of that approach is similar to that of Irenaeus and our theologians to emphasize the unity of the gospel, even if they concede that there are more accounts of Jesus and his activity and fate and so on, but the theological aim is comparable, and that both and that both Tatian on the one hand and Irenaeus and these others on the other hand would stress the unity of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I think there's a very significant difference, because Irenaeus, on the one hand, emphasizes the unity. On the other hand, he emphasizes that there really are four of these things. And I think that he places equal stress on the unity and on the difference. I think that the traditional gospel titles also try to achieve that dialectical balance. Euangelion kata, singular gospel according to, but nevertheless according to one of four different perspectives. So the traditional gospel titles, I think, try to achieve that balance between unity and plurality. We could also think of Irenaeus's, I think, wonderful and imaginative use of the four figures around the divine throne in the book of Revelation, the one with the face of a lion, the one with the human face, the one with the face of a calf, the one with the face of an eagle. This is his fundamental scriptural justification for the four gospel collection. And of course, those four creatures are very different. And he tries to show why it is that he thinks that well, Matthew is the one that he associates with the, let me get it right, with the human figure. It's actually Mark with the eagle and Luke with the calf and so on. So Irenaeus is very emphatic about the differences as well as about the similarities. So I think this is not the same assumption as Tatian has, that we need just a singular gospel. Irenaeus says, yes, it is singular, at the same time it has to be plural as well, and those two things are balanced. Rather like in the classical doctrine of the Trinity at a later point. You don't emphasize the one at the expense of the three. The one and the three are both equally fundamental. I think it's roughly similar in the case of the fourfold gospel.
Thank you. Juan Chapa, I think. Yes.
Thank you, Francis. Just one question. We were talking yesterday about the canonicity of the words of Jesus, and we were afterwards commenting how sometimes the words were more well kept than the narratives. Have you tested in the Diatessaron if there is more stability or even further elaboration of the words of Jesus?
I haven't specifically looked at that. It would be a little bit difficult to do, because we would have to rely on the Latin and Arabic translation, and there is, I think, a tendency there to push the text more back in the direction of Matthew, to Mattheanize the text. So points where Matthew and Luke have different versions of Jesus' sayings, maybe pushed more in the direction of Matthew. It may be, though, that Tatian follows the example of his teacher Justin, who in, I think it's chapters 15 and 16 of his first apology, quotes a number of sayings of Jesus, and he has clearly studied the different forms of those sayings, certainly in Matthew and Luke, and he has tried to create, on his own initiative, the form of a saying which he thinks is most satisfactory and which he thinks does most justice to the truth. So it's possible that Tatian, in the original form of his Diatessaron, did something similar to Justin and studied the different versions of a saying of Jesus in, for example, Matthew and Luke, and tried to put the saying into the form which he believed was the strongest and the best form, just as Justin had done.
Thank you very much. I have a final question. My wife knows that I always like to have the final word, so I have the final question, even if perhaps if others. So perhaps a little provocation. If I understand you correctly, you would say, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that that Eusebius' title of Diatessaron is something like an anachronism, coming from Eusebius' ideas, making a gospel harmony into a gospel into a gospel harmony, coming from Eusebius' ideas of a canon. Wouldn't it be possible to go one little step further? If you look, for example, into passages where we have the light flowing up at the baptism, which we also have in Justin, I think, and in Jewish Christian apocryphal fragments, if you have a flying Jesus, is it perhaps possible that this anachronism goes a little bit further, that it is not a harmony, not a harmony from four gospels, but one gospel using perhaps not just four sources, but more than four sources?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. The term diatessaron, of course, emphasizes the idea of four, but it does not seem to have been Tatian's term. The term was completely unfamiliar in a Syriac context. The translator has to try to explain it. It's a very odd word, and he feels he has to explain it to Syriac readers of Eusebius. The Arabic translator, again, is puzzled by this strange Greek word. So precisely where this text is best known, the name, the title Diatessaron, is not known. And I think that it's very likely that Tatian's aim is not to use just four sources. He wants to write a comprehensive version of the gospel, which brings in everything which he thinks is valuable and true wherever he finds it. And he may well not have thought of just four main sources. He could well have thought of three main sources, Matthew, Luke, and John, plus perhaps a considerable number of additional sources, one of which would be Mark, but he may be drawing in material from a whole range of other gospel texts. The problem is that all that material that comes to seem non-canonical gets eliminated from the later versions of the Diatessaron that we have from the Arabic and the Latin spheres. And so the Latin and the Arabic text that we have conform much more closely to Eusebius's description of this as a harmony of four texts than the original might have done.
So necessary that I have the last word in this case. So in this case, I say thank you very much to both presenters, now to Francis Watson, but also to Jens Schröter, to you for a great discussion. I think we had a very good session. Thank you very much to both of you.
Exactly the right question. Thank you.